Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 29. In this week's episode, I want to talk about separation anxiety, anxious attachment, and a fear of abandonment, and how they're all kind of intertwined, not only in my life, but I'm sure in a lot of your lives as well. I want to start off by getting into what attachment is. I think when we think about attachment, especially early in childhood, it's a very normal, natural occurrence. I think when you're a small child, it's survival almost to feel like you want to stick close to your parents. They are the people who are taking care of you, who are providing you with the things that you need to live. You're not yet able to walk or talk or provide for yourself. And so I think it's very instinctual. And I think biologically, we're kind of hardwired to do that. But when we get into separation anxiety, that I think comes from this fear of being abandoned. And I think so often separation anxiety and anxious attachment are very similar. I think a lot of those feelings are the same when you're dealing with those two different experiences. So when we talk about being abandoned or feeling abandoned, I think it's just kind of this feeling like you're helpless, like you're left without any kind of protection. And that can be physical or emotional. And that's something that I failed to realize for a long time, even when it comes to trauma as a whole. I thought that most of the things that people experience were physical. There's physical trauma if you get into an accident or a fight. I never really applied that same thought process, especially throughout my childhood, to emotions. I didn't know that you could be emotionally neglected. I didn't know there was such a thing as emotional abuse or trauma. And there certainly is such a thing as emotional neglect and abandonment. And as a child, I think that can be so terrifying. It can feel so scary. And I think it all ties back into this lack of emotional intimacy that I think is such a cornerstone characteristic of emotionally immature parents. I don't think they are capable of emotional intimacy with their child or maybe even their partner. And what that leads to, I think, is this lack of secure attachment. I think emotional intimacy is very much this feeling that you share with another person. That means that you can go to them with anything. You can tell them your deepest rooted fears or insecurities or a mistake that you made, all the while feeling comfortable enough and knowing that they won't reject you for that. They're not going to love you any less for that. And they're certainly not going to abandon you for that. And I think that level of emotional security is so crucial when you're dealing with a parent-child relationship, because I think that can start to form your attachment style very early on. And so if you've got a parent that you feel comfortable talking to anything about, you feel like they're always there with you, ready to listen, and they want to understand you, I think that can really benefit you as you move throughout life and into adulthood, where now you can form really secure friendships. You're not fearful that something that you say or do might result in the complete dissolution of a relationship or a friendship. But when you are faced with something like that throughout childhood, throughout those early developmental years, I think it's so easy for that mentality and a lot of those feelings to persist into adulthood and to permeate other relationships in your life with maybe a healthy person. It could be a healthy romantic partner, a healthy friendship, but because you don't have that base, that foundation of emotional intimacy, you haven't really experienced what that's like, you can start to kind of employ all of these different emotions and techniques that maybe you once did throughout your childhood to make some kind of a connection with your parent, with these other people, because you still carry with you those same fears. You think that they might do the same thing to you that you feared your parent doing, or maybe that your parent actually did. Which kind of brings me to this idea that when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent, they're so self-focused. especially one who displays narcissistic tendencies. There's a lot of self-centeredness that takes place here. The focus is always on the emotional or the physical wants and needs and desires of the parent. And so as a child, I think it can be really easy to feel like your parent is not present unless you're doing or saying something that better serves them. And I know it's a really common experience. I've heard so many people's stories about this, where you start to feel throughout childhood, when you are raised by a parent like this, like the price of admission for any kind of relationship is self-sacrifice and self-neglect, where that almost feels noble, where it's like, I'm going to put my own feelings and emotions and interests aside so that I can be a better person for you. I can better serve you. But the truth of the matter is, when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent, nothing that you say or do will create sort of a lasting impact on them. It won't prompt them to develop empathy all of a sudden. It won't make them capable of emotional intimacy for an extended period of time. And yet, in my own personal experience, I remember feeling like the more I was like my parent, the better I was. I wanted to share in their interests. I wanted to share in the things that they liked and they didn't like, whether that was TV shows or movies or music. And when you're dealing with a relationship, I feel like it's normal for there to be a certain level of mutual interest in the other person. I think that's really important, where, okay, let me listen to the things that you're interested in, and then maybe take it even upon myself to try those things out for myself so that we have something to bond over. But emotionally immature parents, I think, take this one step further. And it goes beyond just these surface level interests. They want you to share in their thought process. They want you to think the way that they think. They want you to share in their opinions of other people. So if they like someone or don't like someone, they want you to feel that same way about that person, even if you never had an individual experience with that other person. If you weren't yet given the opportunity to form your own opinion of them, they kind of want you to just trust them and base what you think and say and do on how they feel, because they're always right? I think emotionally immature parents, especially those who display narcissistic tendencies, I think they live within this diluted version of reality that we talk about so often, where they really create this version of what's going on, of the people that they like and don't like, of the things that they have done or haven't done, and the things that have been done to them. They create this entire narrative. And I think, when you're a child, it can be so easy to subscribe to that, especially if you're encouraged to do so by a parent. If you receive positive reinforcement when you're a little nasty to the person that your parent said that they didn't like, that you shouldn't like also, because maybe way back when they did this to them. All the while, we don't know if this is true or not. We don't know what this person is actually like. But I think so often, so many of us grow up with these values and these beliefs that are introduced and reinforced to us, like our parents only want what's best for us. You can trust your parents because they're doing everything because they love you and they care about you. Your parents are adults, and so they know more than you do. You should look to them for guidance. And so when you have all of these ideals that are instilled in you from a very young age, I think it's so easy to just blindly follow a parent. And it's not until maybe a little bit later on that you can start to realize some of these more unhealthy behaviors and these toxic tendencies that can show you just how wrong it was for your parent to expect you to follow in those same footsteps. And so in my personal experience, I think I can trace back my anxious attachment, my separation anxiety to some early experiences in my life. I think there was kind of a precursor or a precedent that was set very early on that felt kind of subconscious, where I wanted to do all of the same things that my parent wanted to do. I wanted to feel the way that they felt. And, when you're born, I read this once and I don't know how accurate it is, but it said something along the lines of, for the first 7 months that you're in the world, you don't necessarily understand or feel like a separate person. I think because you were a part of someone else, you still kind of feel like that for the first little chunk of your life. And then within that first year, you start to recognize yourself as a separate person from the person who gave birth to you. And so while it's normal for a short period of time to feel like an extension of another person or to feel like the same person as someone else, it's normal throughout childhood to kind of start to develop a bit of individuality, a sense of personality, and understand that you are not the same person as your parent. But when you're dealing with someone, I think, who thrives on control and manipulation, who wants to have power over someone to influence the way that they act, the things that they say, the way that they treat others, a child in a lot of ways is a perfect candidate because you have that natural inclination for attachment. You have that feeling of wanting to be close to a parent. And when that's manipulated for someone else's own benefit to further their own narrative or their own personal goals in one way or another, it can be so damaging to the child. And so I remember feeling like I just wanted to be like my parent. I wanted us to be really great friends. And I thought the way that we did that was through being the same. And I think this is something that happened over time subconsciously, where maybe I started to connect the dots in my head, where the more things that we would do that were alike, the more I shared in my parents' thought process, the more I did what they wanted me to do and said what they wanted me to say. That was when our relationship seemed the best. That was when we would do things together, when we would have fun, when I was getting positive reinforcement. And so I think I was sort of conditioned to believe that I was doing the right thing here. And so that pattern of behavior continued for most of my life while I was living with my parents. So you've got this kind of underlying feeling of being completely enmeshed with a parent where they're involved in every aspect of your life and you want to be involved in every aspect of their life. And, you know, when you think about a kid being dropped off at preschool or kindergarten for the first time, it's normal for them to cry because they've never been away from their parent for an extended period of time, and this feels scary. This is where that healthy, normal separation anxiety starts to kick in, but the parent provides positive reinforcement. They show up at the end of the day, and the kid starts to realize that, okay, I'm in a different place for a little while, but I know at the end of the day, my mom or dad is going to show up and everything is going to be okay. I am safe here. But this is such an easily manipulated feeling when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent to kind of hyperfixate and intensify that separation anxiety as a means of maintaining control over another person. And so I think throughout my life, this feeling was kind of intensified, where if I ever experienced a little bit of separation anxiety, like I didn't want to be away from my parent, maybe I was feeling scared or anxious or nervous, instead of positively reinforcing the fact that, okay, listen, you're just doing this for this amount of time, and at the end of it, I'll be here waiting for you, and I'm really proud of you for going to do it. You can do it. I think it's so much easier for a parent who wants to kind of manipulate this aspect of childhood development to instead maybe keep you from doing those things that are a little bit more independent, to give in every single time and say, oh, okay, you don't want to be away from me. You don't have to go. You can stay with me, or I'll come with you. And I remember as I started to get a little bit older, and you know, I never looked at that as a negative thing, especially when I was younger, because if I was fearful of being without my parent and they gave in and they said, okay, fine, then I'll never leave your side, I was happy. I felt content because I felt safe when I was more closely attached to them. I didn't realize until much later in life how damaging that over-involvement and that enmeshment would be. And so as I got a little bit older, it took on a new form where I was in my teenage years and I was wanting to do a few things outside of my immediate family with some friends of mine. And this newer narrative started to get introduced where if we can't all do something, meaning the immediate family, then none of us should do it. So we've already got this underlying feeling of being incredibly attached to a parent and always giving in to that attachment. So there's really very little room for independence or individuality or growth in that way. And now there's this new idea that's introduced that we shouldn't be doing anything without everyone here. If you are presented with an opportunity that you want to take, but someone else wants to be involved and they can't because it was just an opportunity presented to you, then you would be wrong for wanting to do that. You shouldn't do that, and you're kind of not allowed to do that. So it's this added level of negativity that's being tied to independence. And so I grew up feeling like a long time like I couldn't do anything that someone in my immediate family wanted to do if they weren't able to do it with me, which was ostracizing. It was suffocating at times to feel like everyone always had to be involved in everything, no matter the cost, no matter what I was missing out on. And then as we continue, it starts to get even more and more complex. Now I'm in my late teens, 17, 18, 19 years old. And this is when I felt like the triangulation with my parent and I about my other parent was kind of in full swing. Now, this had been happening probably since the 6th grade, I would say, where my parent would vent to me about my other parent. They would share inappropriate information with me, and they would really try to mold and direct my thoughts about my other parent to better suit the narrative that they've created for themselves. They wanted me to form an opinion of my other parent that was similar to their own opinion so that we could sort of be a team and we could go at it together. If there was ever an argument or a disagreement, I would be there to provide some reassurance because I felt the same way. We were in that situation together. That was kind of how the scene was set. And so now, as I'm getting a little bit older, it starts to get a little bit more intensified. Maybe I just started to recognize it a little bit more. And so when I would be talking to my parent and they would be venting to me and oversharing and doing all of these things that in hindsight they really shouldn't have been doing, it started to take a turn, the nature of conversation, where my parent would talk negatively about my other parent. My parent would talk about how maybe they wanted a different partner. They would outwardly compare my other parent to other people that they've encountered, saying how these other people are so much better in this way and that way. And what this did for me, I didn't realize until I was in a relationship of my own, which we'll get to soon. So you have this triangulation that's taking place now that for me sort of heightened this fear of being without a person that I cared about, because now I've experienced what happens when that person isn't present, right? You look to your parents as an example. And when you see them treating each other and speaking about each other in a particular way, it's no surprise that that might inform your expectations of another partner. Even if they are healthy, you might subconsciously expect them to treat you the same way that you witnessed your parents treating one another. And when there's that level of triangulation and manipulation that's involved, you can project so many of these unhealthy behaviors and tendencies onto an otherwise healthy partner and relationship. And then, of course, something that I experienced that I'm sure some of you have experienced also. When you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent, again, especially one who displays these narcissistic traits, who has this hyperfixation on control and power, and they need to be the center of attention. They need to feel validated externally. They need to feel like they're doing something for other people, they're valued, and they're needed. If they are not content with the treatment that they're receiving from anyone in their life, they might look to you to try to solve that problem. And I've experienced, threats of self-harm if I didn't step up and speak out against this other person. I've experienced my parent actually physically packing a bag and leaving, which when you think about what that experience is like for a child, you have this primary caretaker who, if you've already started to develop an enmeshed relationship, who you're very attached to, who you associate protection and safety with, leave. And not only are they're not leaving for a healthy reason where, okay, maybe things got out of hand and now we just need a little bit of time to cool down. And let me preface me leaving by saying, hey, I'm just going to be gone for an hour. I'm going to go take a walk because I have to collect my thoughts and I'll be back soon, right? If you need anything, call me. There's a way to do this that's healthy. But I think in a lot of different scenarios, there's this narcissistic rage that makes its way to the surface. And then there's a breaking point where if it's not threats to leave or threats of self-harm, then it's actually packing a bag and storming out the door. And so you're just watching this figure who's really important in your life leave you, and you don't know where they're going. You don't know how long they're going to be gone. You don't know if they're ever going to come back. And what's so f***ed up about this, I don't know, I've never cursed on the podcast before, but I literally can't think of another word, is that they want you to experience that fear and that anguish. They want you to imagine what life would be like without them and to be so devastated that when they do return, you're going to be so grateful and thankful and over the moon, and you're going to do everything in your power, more than you were already doing, to make sure that that never happens again. And more often than not, I think when you're dealing with these kind of parents, that means you stepping up to the plate and taking on responsibilities that are far beyond your capabilities as a child, things that you should never be involved in. There are marital problems. There's financial stress. There are all of these things that are adult issues. They're problems that you didn't cause, that in truth, you can do nothing about as a child. And yet you feel a sense of responsibility to do whatever it is your parent wants you to do. And now that you've experienced what it's like for them to leave, you're going to intensify that behavior. So the next time an argument rolls around, even if you really don't want to get in the middle of it, getting in the middle of it might seem better than watching your parent leave again. And so for me, it seems like this is where my separation anxiety is kind of rooted in a fear of abandonment. And so I didn't realize that I was experiencing any of this until after I moved out of my parents' house. I moved out of my parents' house very suddenly, and it wasn't your normal, oh, let's pack up some boxes and I'm so happy for you, but I'm going to miss you and it's going to be so different, but I love you. And there was no positivity around it. It was sudden and it was traumatic, and it kind of marked the downfall of my relationship with my parents, because that was when I started to gain a little bit of perspective about all of the unhealthy behavior that I had been enduring for such an extended period of time. That would also be the beginning of me starting to realize how a lot of those behaviors have manifested themselves in my own life, how they've affected me in ways that I wasn't even aware of yet. And so losing those relationships, having them be so drastically altered, allowed me to experience what that feels like when you have these really long lasting important relationships that just end. And I had never gone through a breakup. I didn't have friends for a long time that parted ways with me. And so this was the first time that I ever experienced someone that I truly loved and cared about, that I envisioned being in my life forever, no longer being a part of my life. And so I think it made it very real for me, this fear of abandonment. I think it sort of manifested itself in a very real way, where now I don't have these relationships anymore. They are not the same as what they once were. I'm not being spoken to. I don't feel welcome. I'm being judged. And it was just a lot of negativity. And I remember after that feeling completely inconsolable anytime I would be away from my partner. And so that was how I started to realize that, okay, maybe I was dealing with a little bit of separation anxiety here. Because after experiencing what that feels like to lose those relationships in one way or another, I think I started to subconsciously project that same fear onto my relationship with my partner, where anytime we would be away from one another, whether it was an hour or 3 hours, I would be so fearful that either something really bad was going to happen that was going to get in the way of us ever seeing each other again. And that could be anything from something really tragic, like a car accident, or something really positive, like him getting an opportunity to work across the country and him taking it and then us not being together anymore. I was so fearful that me not being present, us not being together, would result in something like that happening. I was also so fearful, and this is where that triangulation, I think experiencing that with my parent comes into play, that if my partner and I were away from each other and he was with a friend, especially someone that maybe he had known before me, I was so fearful that they would be speaking negatively about me, that this other person might be convincing him to not be with me. I think there's this fear when you're dealing with anxious attachment and a fear of abandonment that you're not good enough, and that if you don't stick around and continue to try to prove yourself and continue to be a source of positivity in this person's life, that they might start to realize that you're not good enough and then leave. And so it kind of feels like you always want to be present to make sure that they're not having that realization because you're just terrified of them leaving you. And so I would be so afraid and anxious whenever we weren't together, whenever he was spending time with someone other than me, because, at that point, that sense of loss felt so real to me. I had just lost my immediate family and my relationships with them. And I felt like I had no one besides him. Up until that point, I think having not experienced that, you can't feel the weight of it. You can't understand the gravity of that situation until you're actually in it. And it becomes so real so fast. And there would be times when I would tell myself, I would just be crying and I don't know if it was a full-on panic attack, but I would be breathing heavily and fast, and I would try to tell myself all of these things like, it's okay. It's nothing is going to happen. He's going to come home and everything is going to be, normal. And no matter how much positive reinforcement I tried to give myself, no matter how rational my inner monologue was, I wasn't able to fight the physical feeling, the heaviness in my chest, the rapid heartbeat, the crying, and that persisted for a really, really long time. And then COVID hit and we quarantined together, which didn't help matters, but that's a story for another day. I think it's just so remarkable how these really early experiences throughout our childhood and the foundation of our relationship with our parents can really significantly impact our relationships with other people as we move throughout our life. And that separation anxiety for me was the root of a lot of other problems in my life. Problems with friends of mine, problems with independence and going out and doing things that I wanted to do, figuring out who I am. And again, we kind of revisit this idea of being raised by an emotionally immature parent and being conditioned to believe that in order for a relationship to be successful and for there to be any kind of affection and attention, you need to take on the other person's personality and interests. You have to completely neglect yourself so that this relationship can work. That's kind of the mentality. And so bringing that into a relationship with a healthy partner, it's not a positive thing, because that is when you have to start to develop and maintain your identity, especially if you were raised not given the opportunity to do that. As you move into adulthood and you're supporting yourself, that's kind of your opportunity to answer a lot of those questions, like, who am I? What do I like? What do I not like? What's important to me? But if you're applying that same fear of abandonment, that same anxious attachment to another person, you're never going to allow yourself the time or space to ask yourself or answer those questions, which can be really detrimental to you and in turn to your relationship. Because I think relationships really thrive when you have two individuals who complement one another, not two individuals who are exactly the same. And so for me, I let go of a lot of the things that I was interested in. I didn't care as much about the things that I wanted to do. I was more concerned about learning about my partner, taking on the things that he was interested in so that I could be present in his life, because I was really scared of being without him. I think that fear of abandonment throughout childhood became very real when I moved out of my parents' house and just felt completely rejected by them. I lost those relationships and it made me fear losing another one because I now understood how painful it was. It was actually my sister who first introduced the phrase separation anxiety to me. This was maybe weeks after I learned about what gaslighting was. I was actually sent by a friend the power and control wheel, which I think that typically applies to domestic violence or there being some kind of physical violence involved. But so many of the things that were mentioned in there were kind of eye-opening to me in the very beginning because it felt familiar and it wasn't something that I had ever read about before. I thought that this was just my experience. And so I remember she mentioned that and I started to look into it and it just started to make so much more sense. And I understood that I was dealing with separation anxiety. And the more I got into mental health and the long-term effects of being raised by emotionally immature parents, I think, something I've been realizing lately is that I definitely do have a fear of abandonment. And tracing those things back to where they come from helps me to understand why I feel the way that I feel. It explains a little bit about my personal experience and my feelings and reactions to certain things. I don't want to say that it makes it easier just understanding where they come from. I think it's more of an explanation than a solution, but I do think understanding that it comes from somewhere, that it's not just something intrinsic to who I am as a person, it allows me to feel like it's something that I can work against, even if it is really uncomfortable, because I know that different relationship dynamics exist and are successful. I know that I don't have to apply these past thought processes or feelings that I employed or embodied in past relationships in my life to my current relationship. I think a lot of that comes, though, with experimentation and practice, which if you're someone who has this anxious attachment style and a fear of abandonment can be so overwhelmingly scary. That was actually what prompted me to make my very first video talking about mental health back in September. I woke up and I felt like I had no idea who I was, like I hadn't ever really developed my identity, and I had to do something by myself. And so I went to the park and I sat and I just talked. I talked about what I was thinking, and that was the first step in me letting go of that. And what's been really beneficial for me is directly communicating these things to my partner so that if I go out and do something on my own, like go to the park with my dog, when I come home, I know that I'm not going to be met with any kind of negativity. I know that, together, again, having had these conversations and my partner being aware of how difficult this thing is for me and why I'm fearful of it, I can then come home to a cup of tea waiting for me and a hug and reassurance. There's no negativity. I'm not going to come home to find him missing. I'm not going to come home to getting yelled at or being made to feel like a bad person because I was out for too long. I think when you experience all of these things for such an extended period of time in your life, it can be so hard to let them go. And for me, in healing in general, letting go of these unhealthy behaviors and starting to embody healthier ones, it's all been through practice, where you have to do it even when you're uncomfortable, because then the next time you'll be a little less uncomfortable, and then a little less uncomfortable. And then you'll start to realize that it actually is okay. And so that has kind of been my experience with separation anxiety, with this realization that I have a fear of being abandoned, whether that's physically or emotionally, by the people in my life that I look to for love and care and support. I think it's important to trace these things back to understand where they come from, and then to kind of outline a plan of where you want to go in your life, and then take the steps to get there. And to do this through practice and experience. That's probably the best advice that I can give as someone who has dealt with this and continues to deal with it. It's a very real fear that when you develop it in childhood is so incredibly intense. And so, like with a lot of other things, I want to remind you to be patient in your journey healing this. If this is something that you struggle with, journal. I journal a lot. I journal every single day, and it helps me to get in touch with how I'm feeling and my emotions. And it can also help you to kind of track your progress. I am able to kind of look back on journal entries from a few years ago and see how I was feeling about a particular experience, how I perceived a particular action or conversation. And now I'm able to look at it through a slightly different lens, and I can see how those fears and anxieties of mine were making their way into my thought process and into my feelings and my reactions. And so it is a process to kind of let those things go, but it is possible. So yeah, I hope that if you've ever experienced anything like this, any kind of separation anxiety, that you were able to take something helpful from this episode. And if you'd like me to talk about it more, or even a particular aspect of it, definitely let me know in the comments or send me a message. I think with that, I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.